All right, welcome back. So, going on into the next section about the needed reform of logic. Dewey had just been talking about two kinds of things that we can know about, or, well, two kinds of things, the changeable and the unchangeable. And the unchangeable is what we can have knowledge of. So he's going to go on into talking about syllogisms and kind of categories of things that can be talked about in syllogisms. Again, we're talking about Aristotle here. This is not Dewey's theory. He's kind of reviewing some of the history of logic to show why we need to reform it. And it gets a little bit technical. Luckily, again, it's not Dewey's theory, so we don't need to fully understand it, perhaps, unless you're really interested in the history of logic. But I'll say a little bit about it, try to make some of this a little bit more clear than how it is in the text. So Dewey says, talking about Aristotle's syllogisms, and again, a syllogism, kind of the classic example is, well, one example, not the classic example, but one example. All humans are mortal, all Greeks are human, therefore all Greeks are mortal. And I'll have more to say about that later. Just want to give an example up front. So when I say syllogism, you've got these two premises, which when you go through them, results in a conclusion that should be logically sound if you've done it correctly, if you've set it up correctly. So then you can know something that is maybe not immediately evident based on what is evident and what's kind of right in front of you. All right, so anyway, Dewey says, the first type of syllogism is that of rational knowledge, which is knowledge in its complete sense. This syllogistic form is strictly necessary and demonstrative in its contents. The other type of syllogism expresses contingent knowledge, which has various degrees of probability, but in no case is necessary because its subject matter sometimes is and sometimes is not. So we've got these two kinds of syllogisms, rational and contingent, right? Rational knowledge and contingent knowledge, or perhaps syllogisms leading to, resulting in rational knowledge, and syllogisms resulting in contingent knowledge. I've been wondering, and I'm not quite sure, but there's a distinction in Aristotelian logic between universal syllogisms and particular syllogisms. So universal syllogisms are ones where you're talking about all things, all members of a group. So all humans are mortal, right? We say all humans. We're talking about everything, so it's universal. Everything, or all members of a group. And then there's particular syllogisms which involve some things, like some humans, some animals, right? And this doesn't seem to be quite the same. Maybe there's a relationship. I think it's more a matter of the categories involved. So later on, Dewey is going to talk about the sensible species, like hot and cold, wet and dry. And these maybe are, if a syllogism involves these kinds of things, maybe that's going to give us contingent knowledge because, things are always changing. Something is dry one minute and wet the next minute, or hot. Your coffee starts out hot and then it gets cold. So that might be contingent. Whereas syllogisms involving kind of fixed categories, these unchangeable things, might result in rational knowledge. So that's an element of confusion here where people might be confused, and where I get a little confused is Dewey is talking about rational and contingent knowledge, but there's also this kind of division in Aristotelian logic between universal and particular, which sounds similar, but is maybe not exactly the same. So just put that out there. Anyway, we were talking about rational knowledge and contingent knowledge. and that's maybe more a distinction in the subject matter that we're talking about. The relation of inclusion is basic in both forms. Inclusion, however, involves exclusion. So when you're making a syllogism, you're including some things, excluding other things. Right? If you say all humans are mortal, you're including all humans, you're excluding other kinds of things. That which is fixed and permanent by nature excludes every other substance by its very nature. Being just what it is by reason of its eternal nature or essence, it is not anything else. Thus, in addition to the fundamental logical form of universal, complete because dealing with what is whole by nature, and necessary propositions and relations of propositions, there are positive and negative propositions corresponding to ontological inclusions and exclusions. All right, that sounds complicated, but again, I think it gets into these categories where you have categories that are fixed. So things like the humans, animals, plants. These were thought by Aristotle and by the ancient Greeks to be kind of timeless categories, whole by nature. And he mentions here positive, negative propositions. So in syllogisms, you can talk about all, right, to include everything, or you can talk about none or no, right? No humans are immortal, you might say. I don't know if that would be something Aristotle would agree with, but anyway, that's an example of a negative proposition, negative universal proposition. And these positive and negative propositions, if we're talking about universal and necessary propositions and relations of propositions, then the positive and negative propositions that we could make, like all humans are mortal, no humans are immortal, correspond to reality, what is included and excluded in reality, right? It should be observable, or even not observable, but just, as part of the nature of the universe that, say, all humans are mortal. The so-called major and minor propositions respectively set forth the including and included subjects, while the middle term is the ratio or logos, reason, the principle of measure and limit, which is the ground of inclusion or exclusion. So again, just to make clear what he's talking about, syllogisms have major and minor premises or propositions, as Dewey says. So the major proposition could be all humans are mortal. The minor proposition then is all Greeks are human, with the outcome that all Greeks are mortal. The middle term here is human, because that's in both of the premises, or both of the major and the minor proposition. All humans are mortal, all Greeks are human, and because you have this common term, then you can get a rational outcome, all Greeks are mortal. It is indispensable in reasoning, and I think, is he talking about the middle term here, or what is it? The so-called major and minor propositions, respectively, set forth the including and included subjects. Well, yeah, and to make that clear, so the subjects are humans and Greeks, right? We're talking about all humans, all Greeks in this example, in the middle term, humans. Is the ratio or logos, reason, the principle of measure and limit, which is the ground of inclusion or exclusion. Yeah, so human is the ground for what we are going to include, what we're not going to include. I think he's talking about the middle term here. It is indispensable in reasoning, not because of any peculiar property of quote-unquote thought, but because of the inherent connections in nature which bind quote-unquote subjects together in preventing their mingling. And I'm not sure why he's putting scare quotes around stuff, but subjects we've seen in earlier episodes are complicated, right? The meaning of subject and object switches throughout the history of philosophy. So he just wants to show that maybe that we are talking about, subject matter or the objects of, inquiry, let us say, which would have been subjects for the Greeks. And so this is important. The middle term is important, is necessary because of the necessary connections among things in the world, it would seem. Right? So human, we're talking about human, right? All humans are mortal, all Greeks are human. Yeah, so the category of human binds things together and excludes other kinds of things, like plants. Since the middle term represents the principle of inclusion and exclusion in nature, it expresses a universal or a whole. So it's not just a kind of convenience, but the middle term is actually something ontological, something found in the world. It's not just a concept, an abstraction in terms of Greek thought. So it expresses a universal or whole, right? We're talking about all humans. If it represented that which is particular, broken, and partial, it could not be the ground or reason of that conclusion, which is the exhibition in knowledge of exclusions and inclusions in nature. So we've got conclusion, exclusion, inclusion. Right. So if it represented, if we just write about a partial thing, maybe like the sensory qualities, we don't get a kind of universally valid conclusion, just a contingently maybe valid conclusion. All right, but let's go on. There's a lot of complexities here, as you may be aware, as you may have noticed. So we'll plow ahead, partly because, again, I want to get back to Dewey's theory, so we've got to get through this chapter. So Dewey goes on, that which is included or excluded is of necessity of a kind or species. So it's a category of things, right? A kind. Categories include things, exclude things. For singular objects, a man, a rock, a particular community come into being and pass out of being. They are particular, partial, not complete. Okay, so here's a better maybe explanation of what he means by partial, talking about particular things. And again, this gets into that universal particular distinction that you find in Aristotelian logic, which, again, I'm not quite sure. Maybe this is coming more into view now for me, but I'm not quite sure how that maps onto, if at all, to the rational contingent distinction. But yeah, singular things, a man. So there's a famous syllogism about Socrates, something like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. But that's about a particular thing, right? So it's kind of incomplete. It's not about all members of that category or no member, what is included or excluded from that category as a category, but it's about a particular member of a category that comes into being and passes out of being. Like after Socrates is dead, does it still make sense to talk about whether or not he is mortal, right? They are particular, partial, not complete. The species or kind of which the singular is a part is eternal. So humanity is a species, and as a substantial species, it does not originate nor pass away with the birth or death of Socrates, Alcibiades, Xenophon, etc. Sorry if I mispronounced any or all of those. The substantial species is necessarily present in every particular or part, making it to be what it is, whether man, horse, oak tree, or rock. So the universals are part of everything, but particular things come into existence, pass out of existence. But that fact does not say anything about the eternality of the categories themselves. That which belongs inherently and necessarily to a species is its nature or essence. Definition is the form which essence takes qua known. So when we figure out what the essence of some category is, we state that, we define it, right? We give a definition. When we know the essence, we have a definition of it. Far from being verbal or even a convenient process or product of thought, quote unquote thought, definition is cognitive grasp of that which defines, marks out, ontological substance. It marks off from everything else and grasps its eternal self-same character. So again, for the ancient Greeks, for Aristotle, definition is not merely a verbal thing, a convenience, as some more modern thinkers might have understood it, where it's just something to help us get around. It's actually related to how things really are, right? When we correctly define something, it means that we're really grasping the reality of something, of a substance, and how it's marked off from other substance, and how it is kind of what its eternal essence is, its eternal self-same character. Species, moreover, form a graded hierarchy. There are sensible species, I mentioned this earlier, there are sensible species represented by the qualities wet, dry, hot, cold, heavy, light, for example. Here, the phase of change of the physical is at its maximum. Right? I think in the previous episode, we talked kind of about the metaphysical and the physical, the unchanging and the changing. And when we get to the sensible species, this is the most physical, right? Because these are very temporary. They're not definitely not permanent, right? Nothing is permanently wet. I don't know, is water permanently wet? It does evaporate and so on. I don't know. But sensible species have these changeable qualities. These qualities are always transient and always tending to pass into their opposites. Nevertheless, while particular existential qualities change, their kinds are fixed. So those kinds are fixed of wet and dry and hot and cold. Those particular kinds of things are fixed, even though wet things become dry, hot things become cold, heavy things become light, and so on, and vice versa. Therefore, a lowest kind of cognitive apprehension, that of sense, can exist with respect to them. Even sense, in order to apprehend a quality, red or hard, must include it in its appropriate species, must classify it. So when we have a sensation of something as being wet or dry or red or blue, soft or hard, we're classifying, right? But this is the lowest, kind of the lowest level of classification, sensory classification. At the other extreme are species devoid of matter and change. The objects in which their essential nature is embodied are constant and unswerving in their activities and movement. And he's going to give an example. So species without matter, right? Matter is that which changes. But there are categories of things which are not material. The typical Aristotelian instance is that of the fixed stars, each of which pursues its eternal round without any variation. Of course, now we know stars change, they are born, they die, they're made out of bits of physical stuff. But Aristotle didn't know that, of course. So if you can't observe stars very closely, they do seem fixed, right? They're always up there. They move, of course, but they seem to, as far as, if you observed them over the course of your life, you would not notice very many differences unless you were very lucky, happened to be in the right place at the right time. Otherwise, the stars seemed very fixed. They seemed to travel in a fixed way, kind of return and return. So they seem to be eternal, unchangeable. Between these two types of species, between kind of those sensory, transient, changeable species and more fixed species like stars, maybe souls or something like that as well, between these two types of species come all other kinds of phenomena and objects in the universe. To go into detail about them would be to rehearse the physics and cosmology of Aristotle, which we don't want to do. Suffice it to say that each kind is fixed in the order of nature, and hence in degree of scientific or demonstrative knowledge, by the relative degree of variation to which it is subject. So we can have better knowledge of things that are unchanging than of things that are changing, according to this way of thinking. So there's degrees of knowledge, there's degrees of changeability among these species. Relative degree of variation. So the latter trait, this variation, marks the extent in which matter, the principle of instability and variation, is present. So the more matter, the more changeable. The higher species are marked by regularity of movement toward a fixed end or completion. So in the way the stars have a regularity of movement. I don't know that they have a fixed end, but they complete a cycle, let us say. It is to be noted that the activities of living things are marked by an unusual degree of regular recurrence. So talking about the category of living things, which do have a regularity. This fact means that they are actuated by an unusual degree of self-movement. Always a little bit put off by Dewey's use of the word actuated here, but it's an observable thing that living things move themselves, right? That's one of their characteristics, let us say. So self-movement. Their energy of self-movement is such that it resists change due to external circumstance much more than is the case not only with sense qualities, which are subject to change from all things about them, but also than in the case of such phenomena as weather and all inanimate things. So the energy of self-movement that living things have distinguishes them from sense qualities, which are highly dependent on the environmental circumstances, wet or dry, as well as distinguishes living things from inanimate things, rocks, let's say, dirt, and weather. So self-movement, it resists, it sounds weird to say that it resists change due to external circumstances, but the fact of the self-movement of plants and animals appears to be an unchanging fact about them. Of course, now we know that it's highly dependent on environment as well, but we're not talking about what we know now. This self-moving and self-governing trait of living creatures is of special importance because there is a qualitative hierarchy among living creatures. At the lower and inferior end are plants with their vegetative functions, which consist in absorption and assimilation of food. Energy of self-movement marks also the various species of animal life. So we have a hierarchy of species in terms of whether how changing they are, how much matter is involved. We also have a hierarchy kind of within species. There's a hierarchy within the category of living things based on how much self-movement they have. So plants are relatively simple. They have not much self-movement. They absorb and assimilate food from the environment. Animals are higher than this. They're able to move around much more, do many more things. But at the apex is man. The top of the hierarchy is man. He retains both vegetative and animal functions, so sensation, appetite, and locomotion. But insofar as man attains to rationality as such, pure in the sense of freedom from need, sensation, and sense perception, the energy of self-movement comes to completion. So I don't know if I read that right, but pure in the sense of freedom from need, sensation, and sense perception. So the more rationality that we have, kind of the higher we are in the hierarchy, the more self-movement we have, right? So rationality gives us extra self-movement, extra freedom from things that constrain animals and much more that constrain plants, right? Reason is pure self-moving activity, having no dependence upon and no truck with anything outside itself. So reason is, a pure thing, pure self-moving activity. It's not dependent. And again, this is the Greek idea or ideal that reason is ultimately not dependent on what is outside of it, on the outside world. Such pure self-activity defines God, and so far as mortals attain to it, they put off mortality. Right, so a pure reasoning creature, I suppose, would be a god. And the more that humans partake of reason, the more they exercise their reason, the more they, as Dewey says, put off mortality. Okay, and then I'll stop here. Next, Dewey is going to give us some lessons from this, right? But we'll get into that next time. All right, so that's all for now. See you later.